both Anthony Joshua and his promoter Eddie Hearn have been speaking over the past few days about Deontay Wilder and the fact that he's missing in action, MIA. Now, AJ is very keen to hear from Wilder because prior to his loss to Tyson Fury, Wilder was a very vocal fighter, always on social media, always doing interviews and making his feelings known. But since that loss to Fury, radio silence. So AJ's keen to hear from him with regards to the whole costume controversy, with regards to the injury rumors, with regards to the situation with the Tyson Fury trilogy, and why he's been so quiet. Eddie Hearn thinks that Wilder maybe doesn't want to carry on boxing anymore and is possibly contemplating retiring because he seems to have vanished from the earth. Johnny Nelson in recent weeks has been saying something similar, that he doesn't think Deontay Wilder is going to fight again, and if he does, it won't be for a long time, maybe 2 years. Now, we all have strengths and weaknesses. I've got strengths and weaknesses. You've got strengths and weaknesses. Not everybody is as aware of what their strengths and weaknesses are as other people, but we all have them. I'm a very introspective person. From when I was a young child, I was always looking inward and trying to understand my own mind and what makes myself tick. And this allowed me to then go on and gain a good understanding of what makes other people tick. Now, obviously, we all have a combination of nature versus nurture in terms of what makes up our personality. And there are different factors. So some people are going to have a different psychological composition than other people naturally. And then, of course, the external factors, the experiences, etc., even diet and what have you can all contribute to the way somebody thinks and behaves. But I say all that to say this. One of my strengths, such as they are, is the ability to understand human psychology. And as I say, I was like this from when I was a kid. Long before I actually started studying psychology, I had an aptitude, a natural aptitude for understanding human psychology, what motivates people, why people think the way they think, why they do the things that they do. And particularly with regards to the sport of boxing, because of the fact that I boxed myself and I've been following the sport for several decades, that is one of the strengths that I have, is understanding the psychology of fighters. Because I've been in the ring, I've traded blows, I've been through a certain amount, right? I was never a professional, I was only an amateur. But I understand the emotions that fighters go through. I've seen not just fighters in a boxing ring, but street fighters, characters on the roads, and how their personality changed after certain situations and different incidents happened to them, and why their personality changed in that way. I said in the immediate aftermath of Deontay Wilder losing the rematch to Tyson Fury that Wilder doesn't want a third fight. And there were many people who said to me, Hatman, you're wrong. Wilder's got such a massive ego. He's definitely going to want a third fight. With all due respect, these are people who don't understand human psychology as well as I understand it. And they don't understand specifically Wilder's psychology. Because Deontay Wilder was so delusional. He was so out of touch with reality that when he lost, it completely shattered not only his view of himself, but to some degree, his view of the world was shattered into a million pieces with that Tyson Fury loss. So if I can give you an analogy or a metaphor, imagine Deontay Wilder was in a bubble. And this bubble was, let's say full of air or helium or whatever. And Deontay Wilder's floating up and up and up and up and up and up, higher and higher. Deontay Wilder doesn't realize that he's in a bubble. He thinks that he is so powerful that he's able to actually levitate like some superhero. And that's why he's floating up in the air. He's way up in the clouds at this point. Anthony Joshua, he was in a bubble too, but he knew he was in a bubble. And his bubble wasn't that high, and the bubble represents the ego. So from where Anthony Joshua was, he was still below the clouds. He could still see the ground. He knew that if that bubble got burst, it's going to be a hard fall. But he had an understanding of where he was and what the consequences were if that bubble burst. So when Anthony Joshua did fall, when his bubble did burst, yes, he was hurt, but he wasn't so badly hurt that he couldn't recover and come back, train for the rematch with Andy Ruiz and win. But Deontay Wilder was so high above the clouds in terms of his ego, in terms of his perception of himself, believing that Luis Ortiz was the second or third best heavyweight in the world, believing that he was the hardest puncher in heavyweight history and he could knock out a prime Mike Tyson, believing that Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua were terrified of him, believing, and this is important, that because he's American, he had an advantage over British fighters who could never be as good as the top American fighters. This is his perception, or was his perception. Also, within America, there is a belief that some people with a certain skin color are better fighters than people with another skin color. And this is something that Deontay and all the people around him, or many of the people around him within his friend circle and certainly within his fan base, they believed this. They never imagined that when you're dealing with the elite level fighters, that somebody with Wilder's skin color could lose to somebody with Fury's skin. They just didn't believe it. They had a certain perception. Wilder had that too. And this fight between Fury and Wilder took place in Black History Month. Wilder had a load of people around him blowing smoke up his backside who were just as delusional as he was, and his delusions were just out of this world. So he had floated up in that bubble, not realizing he was even in a bubble. He thought he was levitating himself way above the clouds. He didn't even realize there was any ground below him. He looks down and just sees fluffy clouds like pillows. He thinks it's going to be, if he decides to float down, it's going to be a soft landing, right? So when he fell, when his bubble got burst by Tyson Fury, he fell so far, much further in terms of his ego than Anthony Joshua fell. And so he was hurting way more than Anthony Joshua was hurting from the loss. He was even more humiliated than AJ was because he fell much further in terms of his ego. He was far more detached from reality. If the earth represents reality, and the further up you go into the clouds, the further away you are from reality. Look at it that way. So Wilder had a rude awakening that night. He was totally humiliated. Everything that he believed in about himself, about being American, about having his skin color, about being the hardest puncher of all time, about the opponents he'd faced. He thought that he was facing elite level opponents. He thought that he'd beaten one of the greatest heavyweights over the past 20 years when he beat Luis Ortiz. So when you're that detached from reality, when you're that delusional, and that illusion and delusion becomes, gets shattered into a million pieces, it's a lot harder to pick yourself up psychologically than if you're someone like AJ, who was far closer attached to the reality of who he was and his own strengths and weaknesses. I'm coming back to the whole strengths and weaknesses again. AJ understands himself and what makes him tick. He understands his own mind far better than Wilder understands his mind. AJ's a more intelligent guy than Wilder, more introspective than Wilder. Wilder's a much more impulsive individual. He doesn't really understand his own mind. And that was very clear to me for years, that this is somebody who doesn't really understand his own psychology. So the way this trilogy fight with Tyson Fury is dragged out hasn't surprised me in the least. And they say, well, it's to do with TV and there's rumors of an injury and all this kind of stuff. I maintain what I've been saying for the past few months. Deontay Wilder doesn't want the rematch. He's devastated. And the things I've been saying have been echoed. I don't know if they've watched my videos. Maybe they haven't. But the things I've been saying have been echoed by Johnny Nelson, who said virtually the exact same as what I've been saying in this interview right here with IFL about Wilder. And Johnny Nelson, of course, a former professional fighter, far more boxing experience than me. He's been through defeats and what have you. He understands what fighters go through. He understands the different personality types that you find in boxing. And one of the comparisons I've made in the past, as far as Wilder's loss to Fury, was Prince Naseem when he lost to Barrera. And Johnny Nelson brought it up as well. Again, I don't know if he's been watching my videos. Maybe he hasn't. Maybe it's just the fact that he is from the same camp as Prince Naseem. And so it's an obvious comparison for him to make. Because Prince Naseem, I remember very well, for years was saying that Allah, God, will never allow him to lose. I mean, that's really, really dangerous talk when you start saying that God will never let you lose. And Prince Naseem believed in God. I'm not saying he was the most devout Muslim in the world, but he was somewhat religious. Now, if you truly believe in your heart that you've been put on the earth and blessed by God and that he will never allow you to lose, what happens when you go in there against Marco Antonio Barrera and you lose? What happens? It doesn't just affect you in terms of, your perception of yourself as a boxer. It affects you in terms of your perception of yourself as a man, because you believe that God would never allow you to lose. So now you're questioning your faith, or you're questioning yourself spiritually and morally, and you're thinking, okay, well, maybe you still believe in God, but was this a punishment from God because you got too big for your boots? Maybe you're not God's chosen one and all this kind of stuff, because Prince Naseem just got way too carried away with his ego, way too carried away to the point where, like Wilder, he was completely detached from reality. And that's a dangerous situation to be in. As Clint Eastwood said, I can't remember which movie it was. I'm sure one of you guys can tell me in the comments section. But as Clint Eastwood said in one of his movies, it's important for a man to know his limitations. You have to know your limitations. You have to understand that you are mortal. Of course, you don't hyper focus on that, but you have to be aware of it. Obviously you have to focus on your strengths and doing what you do and formulating game plans which utilize and exploit your strengths while protecting your weaknesses. And you look at the opponent's weaknesses and his strengths. And you go in there positive and confident, but with a realistic perception of what you have in front of you, of who your opponent is and who you are. If you go in there with a completely unrealistic perception, you're in trouble. Because when reality bites, when reality hits you, it is going to knock you out of the stratosphere. Okay, because you didn't understand what the actual reality was. Your perception was so far removed from it. It's harder to recover in situations like that. So, yeah, that's my take on Deontay Wilder and where he's at psychologically, why he's MIA. I'm expecting to see him turn up on a milk carton somewhere in the US at some point. Maybe he already has. Will he come back? Can he come back? He definitely has to do a lot of soul searching. The problem with Wilder, as I've mentioned in previous videos, is because he's not a very intelligent guy. He's not a very introspective person. I think it's going to take some third party to come in and help Deontay Wilder psychologically. Help him come to terms with what happened. That is, in my opinion, what is needed here. And this is why I said that even though it seems like an unlikely pairing, Teddy Atlas might actually be a good fit for Deontay Wilder. They're both kind of volatile characters, but the way Teddy communicates isn't really well received by more intelligent fighters. Someone screaming, "Oh, we're firemen," and all this kind of stuff. A more intelligent, more introspective fighter is going to look at that and say, I don't need that. This is all a bit silly for me. Whereas a fighter like Deontay Wilder, who's not that intellectual, not that introspective, I think he could benefit from somebody like Teddy Atlas, who, Teddy Atlas's approach might be a bit over the top and a bit confrontational and not very subtle, but it is psychology based. So even though his tactics in terms of trying to get the fighter in the right psychological state might be a bit caveman, there is thinking behind it. He understands that the psychological makeup of a fighter, varies from fighter to fighter. And the type of personality, the type of psychology that Wilder has, I think would be receptive to what Teddy Atlas does. The kind of motivational speeches and all that kind of business. I think it would work far better on a fighter like Wilder than it would work on other fighters that Teddy Atlas has trained in the past. Now, stylistically, that is where there could be an issue with Atlas and Wilder working together, because, Atlas has worked with people like Vozdek. He has worked with Shannon Briggs, Michael Moorer, more technical fighters, not just the likes of Mike Tyson and so on and so forth. Alexander Povetkin, of course, is very technical. The point I'm making is Teddy Atlas comes from the Costamado school of boxing, and Costamado primarily taught pressure fighters. That was his style, and that was his philosophy. He wanted his fighters to be entertaining, whereas Teddy Atlas, yes, he's obviously was involved with Mike Tyson very early on in Tyson's career when he was an amateur, and Povetkin and some other guys too. But Teddy can also teach more technical fighters. So that might be a criticism some people have in terms of whether Teddy Atlas and Wilder are a good fit. But I just think personality-wise, where Wilder is right now, Teddy Atlas could be the guy. Because he understands what Wilder's going through psychologically and why he feels down. And he has done analysis on ESPN. I'm sure most of you have seen it, where the person that actually uploaded that video, they left out the bit where Teddy Atlas talks about Deontay Wilder's strengths. But he did this analysis, and in the first section of the analysis, he was talking about Deontay Wilder's weaknesses. Atlas can help sort some of those technical deficiencies out. Wilder's never going to be, technically brilliant or anything, but I think Teddy could polish him up a little bit and get him to understand how and when to use certain punches, get him to understand positioning better, and get him to understand tactics better, not just tactics in the ring, but also psychological tactics. Because this really is an area where Deontay Wilder's lacking. Deontay Wilder really has no psychological tactics other than, staring at people and talking about catching bodies. But this is all very rudimentary stuff. He's not very sophisticated with any of that. And really, I'm not even sure whether those are tactics. Yes, he's in some instances trying to intimidate people, but that's more to fuel his own ego, I think. That's more to reinforce the perception that he has of himself, that people should be scared, rather than him actively trying to get under his opponent's skin or unnerve them. I think Wilder's just somebody who was on a massive ego trip, and everything he did was just to fuel his own ego. As I say, reinforce his own self-perception. So anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Will Wilder come back? Is he as mentally affected as I'm making him out to be? Do you think that he maybe wants to walk away from boxing like Eddie Hearn is saying and like Johnny Nelson is saying? Or do you think he's going to surprise us all and come out the woodwork and be better than ever? You see, Anthony Joshua, when he lost to Andy Ruiz, he did a few interviews and he talked about the loss. And right after that fight, when he got beat up by Ruiz in New York, he went out into the streets in New York and he was still meeting people. He was still out and about. He didn't hide. Same way Dylan White right now is not hiding. It reminded me of Lennox Lewis when he got knocked out by Hasim Rahman. Lewis didn't hide. Lewis was out in South Africa. He was supposed to meet Nelson Mandela, and he did after the fight. Didn't hide anywhere. It shows that he'd taken the loss. He'd accepted what had happened to him, and he was ready to right the wrongs, correct his mistakes, and come back. Now, AJ has never been a particularly big trash talker. AJ lets his promoter Eddie Hearn do most of his talking. So in the aftermath of that Ruiz loss, you heard bits and pieces from AJ, but it's not like he was on Front Street every day, mouthing off on social media. No, but that was never his style. So AJ remained in character. He wasn't acting out of character after that Ruiz loss. Whereas with Deontay Wilder, he's completely changed character. He was always out there boasting, bragging, gloating when Anthony Joshua lost, etc. Now he's gone missing. I've seen this happen to people in my own personal life many, many times over the years. I've seen guys on the roads who are bullies and braggadocious, loud characters. And one day they get knocked out in a street fight and this guy turns into a monk. I mean, this guy, his whole personality changes overnight. Because same way with the bubble analogy. Psychologically, his ego, he was so way, way above the clouds that when his bubble got burst and he fell down from a great height and hit the earth, boy, did it hurt. It shattered him into 1,000 pieces, metaphorically. I've seen it happen to people over the years, and that's what happened to Wilder. Yeah, let me know what you feel, people. I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.